So today we're moving to look at Surrealism, having just been looking at Dada. But before we look at artists who actually are referred to as Surrealist artists, I want to look at one independent artist, not a Surrealist, but someone who influences Surrealists a great deal, Giorgio di Chirico, Italian artist. Dada is probably the biggest visual source of Surrealism. Surrealism shares with Dada a certain kind of nihilistic quality. It has shares with Dada. Surrealism shares with Dada a sort of politicized interest, a desire to link art to life, a sort of an anarchic anti-establishment spirit. More specifically, it's linked by the use of chance techniques, shock tactics, you could say. Linked also at the level of personnel. An artist like Max Ernst, for instance, was involved with both the Dada, Cologne Dada in his case, and then later Surrealism. But there's something different in Surrealism. There's a sort of poetic dimension, just to put it in simple terms, that isn't really there in most Dada. And Di Chirico is one visual source for that. He's influential on the works of Dali, Magritte, Tanguy, Delvaux, Ernst, many different Surrealist artists. And his influence is probably strongest in the 1920s, which is the decade when Surrealism comes into being as a movement. In the formative years of Surrealist painting. Actually, some of these artists are influenced by him before Surrealism comes together as a distinct named movement. So just showing you one example of his work, Nostalgia of the Infinite from 1913 to 14. Fairly typical mature work of his. In his work you see a clarity of description. Nothing is vague or undefined. Everything is something that we know of from the real world. There's no sort of fantasy element there. Yet there is some kind of strange otherness or strange kind of poetry to it. It's partly just the stillness of the scene, the emptiness of the scene, a sense of expectancy. The shadows are an important part of that. You see a shadow of something that you don't even know what that is, something that maybe is about to enter stage right into the scene we can see. Shadows, I should say, is not just a characteristic in this work, a very sharp shadow of the building and then shadows of, these are shadows of people. This could be a shadow of a presence, a human presence, we don't quite know. But it's not just a property of this work, it's a property of a lot of his work. There's a certain kind of obsessiveness about his iconography. Certain themes come back again and again in his work. Obsessive symbolism. The tower, for instance, is a symbol that we see in a number of his work. One gets the feeling the symbolism is not programmatic. It's not like the symbolism of Baroque art where we say, a woman with a trumpet symbolizes fame. Everything, we know what everything means. That kind of tabulated type of symbolism where everything is pinned down. No, it's a very personal symbolism. It's not something that he's dealing with kind of given literary associations, particularly with a particular object. There's a lot of these cityscape scenes, buildings, and sometimes it recalls the Italian cityscape, his native country where there are indeed lots of older buildings to be seen and little city squares and town squares. He's Italian, as I say, but yet he was born, spent his early life in Greece, born in 1888, spent early life in Greece. His father was a railway engineer working there. He studied in Athens, and art training there, fairly traditional one, but later moved to Germany, to Munich, where he became interested in the work of Böcklin, amongst others, German symbolist art. This is Böcklin's Isle of the Dead. Actually, there's more than one version that he produced of it. It's his most famous painting. This is what De Chirico says about Böcklin. You can see how, from his description, how what he's admiring about Böcklin is actually true of his own work too. He says, he, Böcklin that is, never painted a fog. He never traced an imprecise contour. In this his classicism and greatness consisted. Each of his works evokes that same disconcerting shock of surprise we feel when we meet an unknown person whom we think we have perhaps seen once before, though we do not know where or when. In a city, or when in a city near to us, we come upon a square, a street, a house, which we mysteriously seem to recognize. This is the feeling commonly referred to as a feeling of déjà vu, as if we're already familiar with something that's strange. Well, yeah, that's something true with De Chirico's work too, that the absence of imprecision. This is a famous painting of it's a coffin, a shrouded figure mysteriously being rowed across to an island for burial, with the cypress trees, which are symbolic of death. It's another Böcklin image. Odysseus and Calypso, so 1883. This is a mythological image, more straightforwardly so. But there's this element of mystery in the way that Böcklin has interpreted it. This shrouded figure, the mysterious figure. As well as producing those cityscapes, there are also works by De Chirico which seem more like still lives in a way. So this is The Evil Genius of a King, 1914 to 15. Various objects arranged on a sort of table-like surface, but that surface is raised up, like the perspective. There's perspective in this work, as there was in the previous work by De Chirico we were looking at, but the perspective is slightly exaggerated, so there's a slight sort of sense of destabilization. The objects are well defined, but they're rather enigmatic. Maybe we could think of them as sort of mathematical models, expression in physical form of some geometric concept or something like that. Remember, his father is an engineer, so that maybe there's some associations with his father and the tools of his father's trade. A railway engineer he was. The title introduces also this element of obscurity, lack of clarity. As well as being in Munich for training, he also went to Milan in 1909, and he was in Florence around that time. Before long, he also finds his way to Paris. He's connecting there with the Parisian avant-garde. There's no direct copying of the the styles that were most in vogue in Paris when he went there, but he is nevertheless in some kind of dialogue with the avant-garde. His more realist, precise manner nevertheless has some kind of dialogue with those developments. So, for example, this work, The Anxious Journey of 1913, I think we could relate it to a work like the Cubist painter Delaunay's Saint-Savarin, a relatively early work by that painter. It's a church scene, but it has got some of that slightly destabilized perspective feel. I think one could relate the two. There were often these references to railways. So there's often a train in the background, usually in the background, and often a wall. Somehow it's away from us, hidden away, like the wall hides it away here. So one could perhaps say this is related to his thinking about his father as a railway engineer. You know, we can't read the symbols in a normal art historical way of, or this is a public language of symbols that we can refer to, but maybe we want to almost diagnose it, almost like a Freudian psychoanalyst would want to diagnose the meaning of the symbols. Gare Montparnasse, The Melancholy of Departure, 1914. Gare Montparnasse is the name of one of the Paris railway stations, a big, busy railway station. But here it's shown as remarkably empty. Well, of course, sometimes a railway station could have a very empty mood, but perhaps not a major capital city terminal, you know. So the emptiness of it is part of the strangeness, you could say. We still have a railway engine, because that's appropriate to the subject, and hidden behind a wall as before, just a little silhouette in the distance. So there's sort of repetition of symbols. That's what I mean by the sort of slightly obsessive quality. Things coming back, a tower with flags often appear. And then the architecture with the exaggerated effects of perspective and different perspective feels. It's almost like has a little bit of the feel of early Renaissance art, where artists are starting to mobilize perspective as a tool, but they're not yet using it in a fully coherent one-point perspectival scheme. Trecento rather than quattrocento, something like that. But I think it also has to be related to Cubism and the breaking down of that Renaissance one-point perspective. You know, the flattening out of space, such as we get here, the absence of modelling, and the fact that here the two lines of whatever it is, a platform or something, don't seem to converge, whereas the lines here do seem to converge exaggeratedly, you know, towards a vanishing point. That all has a sort of flattening effect. We start to think of the painting as a two-dimensional design. So, although it's not directly a Cubist painting, perhaps it's hard to imagine it without some kind of contact with Cubism. And he was certainly, we know, aware of those artists' work. He had made contact with a Paris-based poet, Guillaume Apollinaire, who was very much in the Cubist circles as well. The bananas, well, it's the only distinct thing in the foreground of the painting, but it's a slightly bizarre thing. On the one hand, yes, in a railway station there may be all sorts of goods being moved around as well as people, and bananas possibly could be such a good, but nevertheless it seems sort of bizarre just to have a bunch of bananas lying there alone in the foreground of a railway station scene. So it's that sort of strange poetry of juxtaposition. None of the things in themselves are unusual or fantastical, but in their juxtaposition a strange kind of poetry seems to develop. The everyday starts to feel strange. Bananas feel strange if you see them in a context where you don't expect to see them, whereas otherwise you might just sort of take them for granted. Remember talking about the train and railway stations generally. It's very different from the futurists. They were also interested in railway stations, but their interest was in railway station as an expression of modernity. For Chirico, I'm suggesting it may be related to his father, the railway engineer, who was away from home a lot when he was a child because of his work. So it could be to do with a sense of separation and loss, in relation to his father. All this is conjectural, it's not something we could sort of pin down. Or it could be something to do with his own sense of being away from home. Here he is in Paris, he's separated from home, feeling the sort of nostalgia or loss or distance or homesickness. All these things could be there. Quite a lot of the titles like this one refer to these sort of issues of separation. Like The Anxious Journey is the title here, The Anguish of Departure, The Joy of Return. These sort of titles are the ones he favours, and they kind of relate to this similar sort of detail. Well, I think one can look at him in relation to his Italian past. Like Piero della Francesca could be an artist that we could pick out as one as having a certain stillness about a lot of his paintings. I'm just choosing almost at random The Flagellation by Piero della Francesca from 1444. And there's something to modernize a little bit odd about, there's a scene of violence taking place here. A man is strapped to a column and is being hit, but in the foreground there's a very sort of peaceful conversation going on. It has that sort of bizarre feel to the modern eye. The stillness of the whole scene joined with a scene of violence. Even the way the clouds are treated, sometimes that kind of can relate to qualities in Piero's works, or the interest in architecture. We know this is a work that Piero himself was interested in, Raphael's Marriage of the Virgin of 1504. The interest in architecture, extreme perspective effects, little figures in the distance. This is some things which have, and the general sort of stillness of it all. These are all some things that have some connection with what Chirico is doing. The Melancholy and Mystery of the Street, 1914. There's a sort of, well, less so nowadays maybe, but at one point, especially so, at earlier points in history, that in Mediterranean countries like Italy, you'd very much see a sort of closing down during the heat of the middle of the day, the siesta period. All the shops would close, everyone goes back home, have their lunch, and then relax. have a nap, whatever. So that's a sense of everything being deserted is something you could have. Here, that again, I'm just showing you a similar scene to those I've already shown, but just to help bring out how much the same symbols come back. You know, the exaggerated architecture and perspectival effects, flags, sharp shadow effects, and here there's even this sort of theme of threat. You know, the little girl is rolling her hoop down the street, and there's this sort of shadow here, almost as if there's someone lying in wait for her. Well, maybe it's not a human being, maybe it's just a statue in the square. There's nothing to be afraid of, but we don't know. Everything is then there's a hint of narrative, but nothing is really defined. Statues actually is another interest, sort of a subject that comes back again and again. I think partly because it's a way of referencing human presence without actually having human presence. It's like a sort of frozen equivalent to a human presence. Another example of a still life, probably one of his really most famous and influential works, The Song of Love from 1914, well known by the Surrealists. Here we have not a full statue, but a fragment of a statue. The Apollo Belvedere, very well known sculpture, so a fragment of the classical past. It's like a human presence, but a kind of, as I say, a sort of frozen human presence, a sort of second-hand reference to the human. Same could be said of the glove. You know, a glove is very associated with the human body. It's shaped to a part of the human body, a hand, yet it's just an object, an empty glove. It's a still life, you could say, but it's an outdoor still life, which is unusual with the architectural setting, the train again behind the wall, a little cloud of smoke. Here you definitely have that sense of bringing together objects that don't normally come together. They're all everyday things, or things one could easily have in the real world, but putting them in juxtaposition, maybe a strange kind of poetry starts to leap from one object to another, join the objects together. This is a strategy that is really inspirational on the Surrealists. We see them using that, trying to get us to have a certain sense of wonder about our everyday world. Not to take us away from the everyday world, but to look at it differently. We're not trying to escape from reality, but we're trying to see reality in a new way. So it's hard to imagine it, although again I'm saying it doesn't look much like a modernist painting, but it's hard to imagine it without the invention of Cubist collage. This is a Picasso example, the first Picasso use of collage. Collage brings together different realities within the space of one image. Painted scene and then a something printed. Once the idea is established, you can bring together all sorts of different things together. You can juxtapose different realities, different voices within the same work. And then it's only one further small step to get something like this, to put a glove and a classical statue together. It's kind of a collaging-like principle that's involved. Bringing of different things together. This is Braque using collage. when Picasso and Braque use it, it's actually fairly conservative in a sense, you could say. But then once the principle is established, other artists can use it in a more adventurous way. Another artistic source is Max Klinger. So this Germanic artist produced this famous series of etchings on the theme of a glove and the story of a glove. A woman drops a glove, a man finds it, and this whole sort of story of what happens. And here the glove sort of ends up discarded along with a lot of other very different objects. So you have this sense of slightly bizarre juxtaposition. We know that Chirico was aware of all that. So all that lies behind this kind of theme of a glove in his own work. Gloves, because they're very personal objects, they have a personality of their own. Hence, in this story, the kind of fetishistic interest in the glove as kind of almost like a part of the woman who's interesting to him. The Scholar's Playthings, 1917. Well, it's a still life again, but this time in an interior setting. Sometimes you get in those outdoor scenes almost like an agoraphobic feeling, a feeling as if the space is so big it would be slightly dangerous to explore it, like the feeling of someone who has a phobia about going out of doors. But then in the interior scenes, almost you can get the opposite, a kind of claustrophobic feeling, a feeling you're hemmed in with so many objects taking up all the space. Often there is this surface on which things are disposed, but it's a slightly irregular placement of the surface, destabilizing perspectival effect. And a very common strategy that he's using here is, and uses in other works, is this idea of images within images. That's also a kind of collage-like principle of how to bring different realities together side by side, not just different things, but different worlds almost. If you say an image is a world. So instead of showing a landscape with buildings and towers, she likes to show, he's showing an image of one. Anatomical diagrams and so forth. It's not a human being, it's an image of a human being. So it's again another way of having a slightly distant reference. There's a human presence here, but it's obliquely evoked, a human presence via an image or via objects that a human being might use. It almost seems it's called the scholar's playthings. They're like sort of adults' toys, something like that. Things that you might have around. For mathematical instruments for a designer or engineer. The disquieting muses. So another image that comes up a lot is this image of mannequins. In this slightly later period this happens. This is a theme from about 1914 onwards. Could be related to his mother. His mother was a dressmaker, I believe, and a lot of women like to do that sort of work. And at that time, making their own clothes, and you might need a mannequin figure to do it. So possibly this is a sort of reference to his mother, whereas the train is a reference to his father, something like that. The castle has been, people have reminded us that this looks a little bit like the castle of the Este family in Ferrara. But there are modern tower structures as well, phallic forms. You could easily get Freudian about it all. in your interpretation. So a familiar range of things, but they produce this derealization effect. Oh, here come the bananas again, the uncertainty of the poet, 1913, and this cast of a classical sculpture. So I think we're getting to see the idea of how repetitive his vocabulary is, not necessarily in a bad way. You know, the sharp shadows, the train in the distance, and so forth. And after a certain point, he completely abandons this sort of signature style and goes back to a sort of classicism. You know, so many artists in the interwar period go back to a concern with the classical, but when De Chirico does it, it's in a very weird way. The Surrealists didn't like this at all. They felt he sort of rejected the very thing that made him of interest. But perhaps from his point of view, it's a sort of deconstruction of his own art. You know, he felt maybe trapped and wanted to find a new space of working. The figure is itself a sort of slightly mannequin-like. In this example, this is The Archaeologist from 1927. Okay, I think that's enough about him. We'll move on to look at Surrealism itself. I'll just say a few things in introductory terms before we look at the first artist I want to consider, Max Ernst. So perhaps the most important word one needs to use when talking about Surrealism to define it would be unconscious, the unconscious. And you know, of course, that's an idea that comes up in Freud's theories. But I think it has entered general thinking in the 20th century as a kind of key word, even for people who have never actually read a word of Freud's writing. You know, it's an important sort of term for thinking that wasn't there really in the 19th century in any real way. Surrealist artists and writers were interested in bypassing the rational mind. You could say it's a kind of critique of the Enlightenment and its rationalist philosophies in the face of the same experience that gave rise to Dadaism, you know, the absurdity and pointless destruction of the First World War. You know, that's what rationality had brought us to, you know, the rationally organized destruction using rationally created tools of warfare. Modern technology, that's what it leads to, you know. And that kind of critique of rational scientific thinking is sort of stayed with us till now in different forms. You know, after the Second World War, it returns in terms of, now we have the power to destroy ourselves because we've created nuclear weapons and so forth. So an attack on rational thinking and putting faith in the unconscious as something that will give us access to a wider sense of ourself, access to the dream world, to free-flowing imagination. Freud himself was a rationalist. You know, he's trying to understand the unconscious to extend the rational mind's domain, really. But they are sort of upending him and sort of taking the side of the unconscious, of the imagination. It's not primarily Surrealism an artistic movement. It's not art for its own sake. It's art for the purpose of trying to change life. Breton, the poet who really is the sort of founder of Surrealism as a movement, he talks about art as a lamentable expedient. It's just something you will use, a means to an end, not let's not treat art as valuable in its own right. So there's this slightly deconstructive, deflationary view about art, inherited from Dada, of course. The goal of Surrealism is to change our awareness, not to produce pretty things, to decorate the bourgeois home. It's modernity and it's discontents. Some people think, well, we can just use rationality to objectively change the world. That could be the Russian Revolution or something like that leads to that, and certain art goes along with that. Technocratic solutions or political solutions to the problem of modernity. But for the Surrealists, the problem is with us. It's not just out there, it's with us. So somehow we've got to kind of dynamite our own minds somehow to escape from the problem. Is not when we're not just held prisoner by forces outside, but those forces are inside us too. We've got to somehow deprogram ourselves to our desires need to be freed from the chains that they're in. Advertising imagery, for instance, is a way in which consumer culture, capitalism affects how we think and what we want. We've got to somehow escape from that narrow, mundane vision of reality and recover a sense of wonder. It's not escape to another realm, to a transcendental realm. It's not a spiritual solution, such as someone like Kandinsky is offering, a kind of escape from modernity. It's not a mystical theory. It's about the real world, but let's see that world more clearly and recover our sense of wonder about it, not some false manufactured glamorous surface that has been added by fashion photography or something like that, but something more deep than all that. It started really by poets and particular writers, particularly André Breton. He's the sort of pope of Surrealism. He can excommunicate you if you're not following his rules. And that gives Surrealism, even Surrealist painting, a certain kind of literary property. It's less concerned with the formal explorations that so much modernist art, like Cubism, abstract art, have been involved with. So often it's quite happy to use a vocabulary that doesn't look particularly modernistic. There is basically two wings within Surrealist painting. There is that wing which uses illusionistic means, like Dali or Magritte, and then there is another wing that uses the modernist methods, like Miro would be a good example. Max Ernst, the first artist we're going to look at, he's in both camps. He starts off with some more realist works, but then he will go back to a more modernist idiom a little bit later on. In the more modernist wing especially, you see the exploration of using automatic methods, fast ways of working. All of this comes again from Freud, the idea of Freud's couch method of trying to encourage the patient to have free associations of their thoughts, to just don't censor, just say what comes into your mind without trying to rationally analyze it. Just let your thoughts come out, and then I, the analyst, can interpret it. So they try to borrow that kind of approach in the creative process. Try to free thought maybe by writing so fast that your conscious mind can't censor, all kinds of dream imagery coming out. And then the visual equivalent to that, just scribbling, just making marks so quickly that your conscious mind can't censor it. Your habits of thinking don't intrude. Something new comes up. Of course, there's a bit of a question to what extent any of the Surrealist painters really followed the strict rules about what Surrealism was supposed to be. André Breton even gives a sort of dictionary definition of what Surrealism is. But not all the painters really follow it. Some of them are actually much more concerned with art for its own sake than the pure goals of Surrealism. And most of them anyway have already begun producing the work that they become famous for before Surrealism comes together as a distinct movement. You know, that's an important point about the timing of it all. The Surrealist Manifesto is 1924, the first Surrealist Manifesto, but many of the Surrealist artists have really found their own style, like Miro, before that point. And so are they really, is there such a thing as Surrealist art actually? Or is it just a sort of label that brings together people doing quite different things? You know, artists sometimes are happy to be associated with a movement or a label that helps to some extent to explain what they're doing, you know, but then there's a limit to how far they're willing to go along with that. Anyway, let's look at the specifics and not go too far about trying to define Surrealism as a whole, given that that may be, you know, it may be that not everyone is following it like a fixed program anyway. So we'll start by looking at Max Ernst. This is the fruit of long experience, 1919. Well, the title is clearly somewhat ironic. That's one thing that the work isn't, you know, something that's taken a long time to carefully make. It's deliberately giving a sense of just being thrown together a little bit. So what we're seeing here is the dada spirit, deconstructing concerns with craft and skill and virtuosity. So Max Ernst is one of the artists involved with Dada in Germany. He's one of the artists who can through which we can show a continuity between those two movements. Very strongly affected by the First World War. He served in the army. He writes this sort of autobiographical statements and writes about himself as if in the third person. He says, Max Ernst died on the 1st of August 1914. That's when the war started. He returned to life on 11th November 1918. That's when the war ended. A young man who wanted to become a magician and find the myths of his time. So as if he was dead during the war is what he's saying. The Hat Makes a Man, 1920. A collage was still with some of this sort of Dada feel of it, about it. You know, his contribution to Dada is often in this use of the collage effect. We've already been talking about collage as a useful tool in De Chirico's case, who's not actually using collage. So strange poetic juxtapositions, absurd effects created by taking real things but putting them in an unusual context. Derealization, frustrating the usual associations or meanings associated with a particular object. So the title of the work, The Hat Makes the Man, it sounds like a kind of advertising slogan to make you buy a hat. You know, you're not a proper man until you've got a hat, but a hat can make you who you are. You know, a hat makes the man. It makes all the difference to whether you're a real man or what kind of man. All that kind of bullshit of advertising that we're all every day, forced to consume. Actually, there's a biographic dimension too. It's his wife's first. He had several wives. His first wife's family had a hat shop, making hats. I think he was left in charge for some period of time. Anyway, he's cut these hats out of some catalogue, presumably advertising material, and constructed these sort of hat trees or hat people. Maybe this one seems to have, two legs. The hat makes the man is the title of the work, the sort of advertising slogan. Well, here is okay. So let's take it literally. Here's a man made of hats. It's like over literal interpretation that subverts the original meaning. So by presenting all this sort of advertising imagery in a new context, a cataloguing of different hats that you could buy, finds a way to subvert it all. This is Max Ernst himself talking about collage. He says, collage technique is the systematic exploitation of the fortuitous or engineered encounter of two or more intrinsically incompatible realities on a surface which is manifestly inappropriate for the purpose, and the spark of poetry which leaps across the gap as these two realities are brought together. I see advertisements of all kinds of models, mathematical, geometrical, anthropological, zoological, botanical, anatomical, mineralogical, paleontological, and so forth. Elements so diverse in nature that the absurdity of bringing them together has a disorienting effect on the eye and the mind, and generates hallucinations which give new and rapidly changing meanings to the objects represented. I felt my sense of sight suddenly so intensified that I saw the new emerged object appearing against a changed background. In order to hold them fast, all that was needed was a little colour or a few lines, a horizon, a desert, a sky, wooden floorboards and such like, and so my hallucination had been fixed. Caterina Undulata, 1920. It's a little bit like the sort of image we saw when we were looking at Picabia, strange pieces of machinery. Yeah, he would have been aware of Picabia's work, fellow dada artist. What he's got here is a piece of wallpaper, and then he's painted over. Sometimes you don't necessarily need collage. You could just create an image by subtraction in this way, add things on top of an existing image, and then you've got a duality in that means. So he's created a kind of landscape based on this wallpaper design, which obviously has suggested something to him. (1921). He's starting to make painting the elephant of the Celebes. It's similar kind of principle at work to his collage works, but now he's using oil paint. He'd mostly ignored paint during his Dada years. But when he returns to it, it's a sort of illusionistic approach to oil paint, very deadpan technique, very inexpressive. There's no painterly quality. He's not expressing his personality through the brushwork or anything like that. So it's about the objects represented and the juxtaposition of strange juxtapositions that spark the poetry. Of course, all this is deeply indebted to Chirico. He discovered De Chirico's work in illustrations in 1919. So a figure like this, a sort of statue-like or mannequin-like figure, that would be one of the most obvious links to De Chirico, apart from the general strategy of using real things but putting them together. The sharp shadows maybe is a De Chirico thing. Well, what do we have here? We have well, the title says Elephant of the Celebes. Celebes is an old name for what we now would call the island of Sulawesi, is one of the islands that make up the Indonesian archipelago. Actually, if you look at Sulawesi on a map, there's one part of the island that has a long thing. Maybe that could be seen as looking like an elephant's trunk, I don't know. Anyway, they don't have elephants in the Celebes. Elephant of the Celebes is apparently a German schoolboy's rhyme, and a kind of dirty, sweary, kind of bad, naughty thing to say, you know, whatever it is that words of it are. I don't actually know the details. So it's a kind of sort of childhood sort of reference. It's about that, not directly about the Celebes. Well, there's something elephant-like though here, or a sort of trunk-like form. But there's also a head of a bull or a minotaur, something like that. Minotaur is a creature that the Surrealists were quite interested in, the mythological figure that was half human, half bull. This is part bull and part, well, hard to say. Actually, very difficult to make out what this main body of it is. But, you know, art historians love this sort of tracking down these kind of things, and they found it looks like a corn bin of some African tribe. You know, after you've harvested your corn in some cultures, simple agricultural cultures, you store it above the ground in some kind of place where the rats can't get at it, and this looks like such a sort of storage bin. So it's something he could have seen looking through anthropological literature, becoming interested in the other kinds of cultures because of their differentness, their strangeness. I think we can work out this here. This looks like a kind of a reappearance of the forms we've seen in The Hat Makes the Man. You know, it's derived from these kind of forms, coming back again, and that's not an isolated case. It happens in several of these paintings of this time, that they relate to what he's doing in his collage work. In a general sense, he's bringing things together. He's not actually collaging, but it has a collage-like feel of his whole procedure, way he's bringing images together. But actually, in some cases, he is taking from particular earlier collages. And then the whole thing is placed underwater. You know, we see fishes in the sky, so it's a strange kind of underwater sky. There's also machinery. You know, again, that maybe reminds us of Picabia and his interest in machinery. It's a little bit more than Dada, because I feel that the whole work has an overall kind of shared mood, there's an overall effect which is often not there in the Dada works. Dada seems more about disrupting what is already there rather than creating something coherent, new thing. Oedipus Rex, 1922. So again, one of these early oil paintings and their illusionistic quality. he was in Paris the summer of 1922, so he's making contact now with the people who are going to become the Surrealists. Surrealism as a movement doesn't yet exist. There's still another couple of years, really, before the manifesto. But already Ernst has a style which we could call Surrealist. Once more, there's very strong influence by Chirico coming through. This general principle of juxtaposing different objects and the strange poetry you get from that. But also, certain details like the putting things on a flat table-like surface with a rising, exaggerated perspective. That's something we've seen in Chirico too. But it's a little bit more violent than anything we've seen in Chirico. It's a sadistic or masochistic imagery of fingers pierced by a saw, some kind of device for sawing into a nut, which is already pierced by an arrow. Well, we saw the imagery of a horned creature in the previous work. We have one here, some kind of mammal, some kind of bird. The bird and the mammal are both constrained in some way. So is the hand in a way. Oedipus Rex, the title, makes us think immediately of Freud. Freud, one of the key concepts of Freud's psychoanalytic theory is the notion of the Oedipus complex. Oedipus being, Freud takes this from a Greek myth, which of course is itself evoked in the painting. It's part of the references that automatically would come to bear on the painting. Oedipus, it was foretold that he would marry his mother and kill his father, and everything he did in his life was to try to avoid that. But all that he did took him exactly to where he was trying to avoid, and the prophecy came true. So Freud interprets that, interprets this, uses that myth to interpret what he sees as a common syndrome of growing up, that the male child will choose the mother as their first sort of quasi-sexual object in their growing up process, that they will somehow be competing with their father for their mother's attention. There'll be a certain kind of psychological dynamic going on which has to be resolved successfully for the child to grow up properly. And obviously it's not... They've got to find a different way of relating to their mother and to trace that desire out into to other objects, as it were. So, by giving that title, clearly it's not some very direct representation, diagrammatic representation of what Freud is saying, but maybe we want to think it might be related to that. Like we could say maybe the images of the two animals that are constrained in some way, maybe this is something to do with the constraining of instinct, the repression of desire, or something like that. Apparently, at least how Ernst himself tells it, his own father was quite a sort of strict father, and there's a certain kind of competition with his father because his father was an artist, a very traditional realistic artist. There's this story about his father painting a scene, and there was a tree in the scene, but he didn't want the tree in his painting, but he didn't feel he could paint what was not there. He had to follow reality. So he chopped down the tree to make the painting and reality, merge, Because we only know his father through Ernst, really. So, this is a kind of biased presentation, of course, and maybe slightly fictionalized. We can't be quite sure. A bit more about Freud. Ernst had studied his work prior to his contact with the Surrealist. He studied philosophy and psychology at the University of Bonn between 1909 to 1914. He didn't really have a kind of traditional art training. He's one of the more intellectual of the Surrealists because of that background. At one point he planned to write a book about the art of mental patience. André Breton, the founder of Surrealism, he went to visit Freud in Vienna, and actually he visited Max Ernst on his way back from that trip, so I'm sure they would have discussions about that. I think even more so than De Chirico, I feel an image like this is somehow about the inner psychological fears and complexes, perhaps a bit more self-consciously so. There's a complicated thing happens, is that once an artist has read Freud, it's hard to look at their art and decode it in a Freudian way. That's one of the complications about a psychoanalytic approach to art history. How do we decode in a psychoanalytic way a painting by an artist who may have read the very books that we are ourselves inspired by in our interpretive effort? Actually, psychoanalysis is a dialogue between the analyst and the patient. So to psychoanalyze a painting is a very un-Freudian thing to do. Painting is a thing, not a person. It can't talk back. It can't say, no, that's not what I meant at all. Or, there's not a dialogic dimension. So maybe we have to be a little bit careful. Yeah.
Is that a nutshell? Like, as that a nutshell? That is.
It looks to be, yes, yeah.
Then it reminds me of Hamlet, like I'm the king in the nutshell.
What does he say? I can't remember that phrase.
I am the king in the nutshell. I'm the king of the nutshell, I think. Like, what he meant is that I'm the ruler of the small space, but however, I'm free in my space. So quite famous.
Okay.
Hamlet. I don't remember how it exactly.
All right, I'll look it up during our break. Well, that's good. Of course, we're talking about a German artist, so maybe Shakespeare is not the first reference that would come to mind, but of course he's very well known all over. Yeah?
It says, I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself the king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams.
Oh, bad dreams.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Well, this could be a genuine discovery. I've never heard this discussed before in relation to Max Ernst. I think it's entirely relevant because with these things it's very hard to prove. I also think it has a vaguely sort of female sexual connotation as well because of the sort of slit to it. I think that's all part of what is involved here. And it's a mixing of animate and inanimate, animal and vegetable. This whole symbol here, this whole element of the painting here, the nut and the saw, whatever, and the hand. This is an example of one of the elements that pre-exists the painting, that exists in a collage work. So it comes into being through a collage and then becomes part of the painting. So when we have an idea like that, I mean, one thing to do is to try and see what evidence do we have about how the painting evolved. In this case, we have a collage, so you'd want to look at the collage. It's slightly changed from the collage to the painting. Information about how the image evolved can often give us insights into meaning, even if it changes from the drawings or other source to the final work. Another thing we can do in that situation is we can say, well, is this the kind of way of thinking that we can see in other works by the same artist? You know, can we find literary references elsewhere in his work, even Shakespearean ones? You know, can we see a pattern here? It's almost like the way a detective might think. We need to think like that art historically sometimes. So if we can see a pattern, then we start to think this is more plausible. Of course, not everything will always fit into a pattern, especially with art, where artists by definition are creative. They go off in all sorts of different directions, but nevertheless and then there's two things here. One is what could have been the inspiration, and the other is what are we supposed to get from it. You know, I don't think we're meant to look at this painting and think of Hamlet. You know, if that was indeed Ernst's intention, then he has deeply failed, because it's only today, you know, in the year 2016, that someone has noticed a possible connection to Hamlet. But it could be that it's important in his own personal, you know, thinking, even unconscious thinking. You know, maybe he's read that line, he wasn't even thinking of it when he made the painting, but somehow it's all in there. Because Oedipus Rex means Oedipus the king, and Hamlet was the son of a king and thinking about kinghood, kingship. You know, free associations like that might come up. He's a king, and then there's some thing about him and his father and his stepfather and all that sort of thing. So it's all relevant to the theme of Oedipus. It's not exactly an Oedipal situation, but it's sort of related. You know, he's got a stepfather that he doesn't get on with. I think it's always good to think like that, but we must be careful not to push one idea too far. You know, we keep it in proportion. It's only one possible reference that is at play here, perhaps. The title tells us Oedipus. Okay, so I think that it's right to bring Freud to bear and the Oedipus myth to bear. Now let's have our break there. That's a good point to have our break.